Imagine you're walking with a friend and you look up at the sky and you see a cloud and you say to your friend, "Hey, that cloud looks just like a dog." And your friend looks over at you and says, "No, that cloud looks like a bumblebee." Now, you both squint at it. Maybe you laugh at each other. You don't agree on what the cloud looks like, but you agree to disagree. But now imagine somebody else walks up and says, "What cloud?" And you're both confused and you point up at the sky and you say, "That white puffy thing up there, that's a cloud." But they just stand there, convinced there's nothing at all. And suddenly, you're not debating dogs or bees anymore. You're stuck on something even more basic: whether there's a cloud that exists in the first place. That's what this video is about. Not opinions, not interpretations, but how even facts are up for debate now, and how modern media makes it worse. Joe Rogan actually helped me out recently. I was about to make a video on this, and then he did a podcast with Bono, and this clip became viral, so I'm just going to play it for you now.
Right, this is the problem. The problem is, for sure, there have been a lot of organizations that do tremendous good all throughout the world. Also, for sure, it was a money laundering operation. For sure, there was no oversight. For sure, billions of dollars are missing. In fact, trillions that are unaccounted for, that were sent off into various, they don't even know where because there's no receipts. The way Elon Musk described it, he said if any of this was done by a public company, the company would be delisted and the executives would be in prison. But in the United States, this is standard.
Now, this video isn't going to end up being about Joe Rogan, but that clip gives us a perfect opportunity to ask, what happens when big public figures say something with total confidence and no proof? Now, he's talking about USAID there, and we're going to pretend that he didn't hear it from Elon Musk. Let's say you're just a regular person with a 9-to-5 job who heard this and thought, "That sounds bad. Is it true?" So what resource does a person like that have to go and find out? Well, it's the news. So I did some field work and I looked it up. So just me, a browser, and some spare time. I started with Ground News. It's a site that shows you which outlets are covering which stories and how they lean politically. You can see down here they rate them left, right, or center. I don't know how perfect the system is. I'm not recommending or saying if this service is good or bad. I just found it useful for what we're doing today. And what I did was I looked at the USAID page and I went through a lot of the stories to just try and find stuff on USAID and fraud. And the first story that popped out, because it's brand new, published 2 days ago, is this story about a USAID officer pleading guilty to taking over $1 million in bribes. He worked with contractors across $550 million worth of contracts, so it's real and it's very serious. But here's what's weird. If you look over on the right here, it only seems to be right-leaning outlets that cover the story. Left-leaning media, at least according to Ground News, didn't mention it. And that's troubling because this story matters. But on the other hand, it also doesn't prove what Rogan said either. This wasn't systemic laundering. It was caught by the DOJ and USAID's own investigators. It was tracked and prosecuted, and receipts existed. So at the end of the day, if this is the story, then the system worked. Mind you, it didn't work perfectly. It could have been better. It could have been maybe caught much sooner. But people were brought to justice. And the second story that I found was a much smaller story. And I think that's why there was only so many outlets that reported on it. And you can see, again, it's right and center. And this was about a smaller fraud case related to COVID aid. And what's interesting is what happened when I kind of dug into the sources of it. So that brought me to this page. And, they talk about, oh, this is how much money was taken, $16,666. You go through the bullet points, but this kind of caught my eye right here. And it's at the very end, the last bullet point says, experts estimate over $1 trillion in COVID relief funds may have been stolen globally, with much lost to scams. That's a lot of money. That is a big deal. And whether or not this is all related to USAID, if it were true, it definitely makes you wonder, hey, is Rogan right about aid programs in the US government? But there's no other context that I can really find in this story related to this figure. What you can do is it mentions this Daily Wire article, and if you go into that, it talks about the same case, which is great. And then at the very bottom here of the article, you see the head of LexisNexis Risk Solutions testified to Congress that criminals stole $1 trillion in COVID money, most of which went overseas. So it then links to that article. But I want to stop here for a second, and I want to take a look at the difference between these two sentences. Again, there's no context provided in the Daily Wire article. Mind you, they do link to the original article, which will give you more context, so I'll give them credit there. But here it says experts estimate over $1 trillion, and then later they say that the funds may have been stolen. In the Daily Wire article, it says that basically this person testified that criminals did steal the money. Estimate is not there, and may was not there. And another difference, it's not a big deal, but in this article, it really shows in the Daily Wire one that it's just one person testifying, whereas this one says experts, plural. So there's differences here, and some of them are significant. I think it's definitely significant to say if somebody's saying if something's a fact and if it's a true number or not, right? But again, they do at least link to the main article. And at the end of the day, what happened here is that this LexisNexis executive said during a congressional hearing that there was this projection of 1 trillion. They seem to believe that that's the number, but it's not a government audit. There's no official report, right? And the other thing that really stood out for me reading this is that there clearly appears to be huge issues with the way that we regulate and try and prevent fraud in the government system. But none of that is mentioned. So if you look at the real problem, at least according to this hearing, it's all the boring stuff. We have weak identity checks that are mentioned. They talk about cross-agency tracking and data sharing that isn't happening. Poor fraud controls overall. And that just doesn't trend, right? That is a message I think is very important. And if you were to fix that, you would probably catch more fraud and prevent more fraud. But no one's going to be making a thumbnail about cross-agency data tracking, right? It doesn't trend. And that's just unfortunate, because I think at the end of the day, the most important stuff is the boring stuff. And finally, even if, say, a news outlet did correct, maybe the Daily Wire corrects this and says, it ends up being $500 billion versus $1 trillion. That correction is not going to, make the same impact in terms of getting onto social media versus that initial story, right? And I think a really good example of that is another story about, let me get it. Marco Rubio and JD Vance. And what happened is they made public claims that only 12 cents of every USAID dollar makes it to people who need it. And that sounds awful, especially if it's true. But the Washington Post found out where they got that from, that number. And there's a very important difference between kind of how it was framed by J.D. Vance and Mark Rubio and then various news outlets that took it after, and what the truth is. And the truth is that that 12-cent figure refers to direct payments to local groups. So the local entities get about 12 cents, where the other 88 cents trickles down, but it goes through international partners, NGOs, or contractors, right? And this was a problem. It was actually a figure that was documented in the previous administration, And in 2023, Samantha Power, USAID administrator in the Biden administration, had decried the industrial aid complex and set a goal of directing 25% of aid to local entities by 2025, right? So they admitted that there's room for improvement and that this was a problem, but it's not like 88% of funds just vanished. That's not what the report said. And at the end of the day, I looked pretty hard and I could not find concrete evidence that systemic fraud with billions and trillions of dollars have gone missing out of organizations like the USAID. Here's what I did learn, though, is that fraud does happen, absolutely. But so does oversight. And big scary numbers go viral, while corrections don't. And that media can shape a story even when it doesn't invent it. And the last story I want to cover is actually the story that I was originally going to talk about for this video. And it's something that everybody covered, and it's about Jake Tapper, a longtime CNN anchor who co-wrote a book that revealed serious concerns about President Biden's cognitive health. And the headline is summarized as Jake Tapper compares Joe Biden health cover-up to Watergate. Now, this wasn't a new problem. It was happening while Biden was in office and while major decisions were being made. But that information didn't show up on CNN's front page. It didn't make a headline. It came out later in a book. And just like with Rogan, this isn't going to be about whether the Biden story is worse than Watergate, like some are saying. That's not the point. The point is that a major journalist had real, verifiable information, and it wasn't reported at the time. It was held back. And that tells us something. Even facts, real ones, are being filtered through narrative usefulness. It's not about importance or urgency. It's about usefulness. And when that happens, journalism stops being a window to the world and starts becoming a mirror to whatever tribe you're in. So here's where we're at. Two people can look at a cloud and see different shapes. That's fine. That's pluralism. But now someone walks in and says, there's no cloud. And that person is louder, and they trend. And suddenly, we're not debating meaning anymore. We're debating reality. And when the facts themselves get filtered, ignored, or buried, truth becomes a matter of tribal loyalty, not curiosity, not accountability. We didn't get here overnight. But we won't get back to shared reality until we start rewarding something different. Nuance, patience, receipts. Not just what fits the story, but what's true, even when it's boring. Because the most powerful stories, they're the ones that don't need spin. They just need to be seen.